Today we are back with Tarot Beyond Tradition with the lovely Dawn and myself, and
Hello.
we're here on my channel today to do the tarot numbers or numerology, however people prefer to reference it.
Reading a little bit more numerologically.
Yeah.
And then I think today we're just going to talk about kind of like more of a bare bones basic, like what kind of we think of in terms of numbers and what they mean.
But I feel like, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, every time I read someone's numerological breakdown, at least some of the numbers are different from either mine or the last one that I read.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody, I think, has a different variation on a keyword for sure. Sometimes even like the kind of energetic essence of the number can like be wildly different. 7 is a really good one. I feel like 7 is the most misunderstood, the most controversial number. 7.
I definitely agree. And people often not struggle with my like 7 of Swords as an example, but they certainly don't necessarily vibe with it if they've come from like a 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗀𝗎. In fact, I can't remember what the 𝗕𝗏 says for 7, but I am thinking the 𝗕𝗏 as well. And also 9 and 10 I find quite interesting because I feel like where someone places completion in particular seems to differ between those two. So
yeah,
I am intrigued.
I have like 3 keywords for every number.
Okay.
And there's a structure to that in terms of how they relate to the suits that I'm working with. We're talking about like pentacles being like related to earth and things like that. So my keywords kind of, I have a base kind of structure for my numbers. They do kind of shift depending on what suit I'm in. And then if we're talking about the major arcana, then I also read those numerologically. The majors for me are these huge, like they're these huge energies, right? Because it's the major arcana. It's the progression of, depending on how you approach it. But the way I see it is kind of like the progression of the human experience, the progression of soul work. And then when you're looking at the numbered minors, those are just minor little facets of that, right? We tend to see the minors as the mundane. It's when people ask me how to start learning numerologically, I always say start with the minors because I think it's easier.
I think that's where I land as well. And mine's not as neat as yours, but I did write it down before this because I was like, oh, come on, Tegan, let's see what this
I did like. Too, because I was like, I'm going to forget.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting experience, which I feel like all of Tarot Tube should hear about. Every tarot reader is that our brains are only like so reliable, and there's always that like little panic. I'm gonna forget something, and it's always a really important keyword that the rest of the time you legitimately work with, see it, and then you try and do a video, and poof, it's gone out your brain. Yeah. It will be interesting because this is quite a foundational offering. So I'll be really keen to hear what people think of it. Not only mine and your similarities and differences, but definitely sort of where the rest of the folks come from on that.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of numerological stuff on old blogs, and I certainly know that some of us have talked about it, maybe more fleetingly publicly, but certainly in our subscriptions. And then I feel like it's written about in more tarot books, but I don't feel like I see a lot of videos about it.
I don't either. And I really feel like book-wise, we're just now starting to see a really big influence in a more number-focused structure. If you look at even like, so take like a big publisher like Llewellyn, some of their guidebooks, like back in the day, you would have never seen a guidebook in numerical progression, as in grouping all the 2s together, all the 3s together, all the 4s together. They didn't really do that back in the day. And now you're seeing this shift where we're getting guidebooks where they are talking about all the twos as their own sort of energy and all the threes. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that really shows how we are as a community kind of broadening our understanding and our experience in our work with the tarot, because we're not so locked into that Rider-Waite-Smith. And now we're getting whole books written about just, you know, working with numbers.
The Witch Sister Tarot, she's got a breakdown in the beginning of what she sees the numerology as, with about, again, I think 3 keywords. And that is a far more dominant system in the Witch Sister, which obviously is not the case in her last tarot deck. So it's fun to see it, but obviously there's still a lot more story to explore in that deck because it's so scenic. And I was thinking when about the pip decks with the numerology, I feel like in one way you do get more of a solid sort of, I use the term structure loosely because it's more sort of outside of maybe other tradition, but it gives you a really nice foundational point that you can pivot from always, no matter the deck. But I noticed that it uses a slightly different part of my brain because there is a bit more memory retention required than there is for the more visual stuff.
Yeah, I distinguish it like in my brain, and when I try to explain it to other people, when I try to explain the weird way I read, tarot is a structure, Rider-Waite-Smith is a tradition. It's overlaid the top of the tarot structure, because the way that I was taught was there is a 78 card structure. Now you can take that if you learn that, and then you can apply it to any deck. You can apply it to any tradition, and then you overlay the traditional elements over the top of it, should you so choose.
I think we saw that in some of the comments on your channel as well. What is tarot? And people were saying, well, it's 78 card structure, and it didn't sort of matter what tradition or approach that people utilized as well. On top of that, it was like, this is what it is as it at its core.
Do you want to start with the aces?
One.
And for me, the 1 and the 10 have a cyclical thing, so I like to say 1 rather than ace when I'm talking numerologically, because they cycle back around to each other in the way that I work with the cards. Number 1, or the ace, I guess we're going to be proper about it. Okay, so I have 3 keywords that I really associate with a number 1, and it does relate to the magician. So there's that underlying magician energy, as well as the 11 energy and the 11th card. And depending on which way you see that can be interesting. I won't go into that because that's like a whole nother level, but just to throw that out there, that's kind of what's happening in the back of my brain when I'm talking about the numbers. So the ones for me, they're beginnings, they're potentials, and it is particularly in the minor arcana, they are kind of the energy, the essence of their suit. So they represent the full potential of what can come from that. So when I'm looking at a suit elementally, if I'm looking at like pentacles as being related to earth, the ace of pentacles would be the essence of the pentacle suit, right? And it represents like the full potential of whatever can be accomplished within the work of the suit of earth, or the suit of pentacles, or coins, or however you see them.
Because there's so many names for that dance.
I know, there's so many names.
I think I'll probably stick to 3 to give us some nice conciseness. But I have got essence, and that is one of my favorites. And I've got seed because it's just forever conceptually made sense to me.
That's such a great visual too. Such a great visual.
It works for me in relation to the progression up the numbers for some of my chosen keywords. It's very like mentally, despite me being a terrible gardener, it's very like it could work through that way.
Me too. Mine's the same. But don't give me a real plant, I'll kill it.
No, so seed, essence, and I think my other favorite one is, which falls in line with possibility anyways, creation. So sort of, but I mean that in a again, it's the possibility of creation. It's the seed. It's the conceptual part of it, as opposed to, which I think is why I struggle with keywords, because otherwise creation could be like, here, there's this finished thing that I've created. And that's not what I mean. I mean like the co-creation of conception. So it's like that key initiator, as it were. So initiation might be a better one, actually.
Initiation's a good one. Is it like the moment before creation?
Yeah, it's like it's like
before it becomes.
Yeah, once you're initiated, something has occurred, whereas an initiation is the process of getting there. So it's the seed of earth and what earth means, or it's the seed of the wand. So this is a creative seed. This is a, you know, energetically expressive one, or this is the seed of the sword. So the thought, the communication, the narrative and stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of how I see it in a very basic sense. If we were talking about like the Ace of Pentacles and how I relate that, the Ace of Pentacles would be the potential of human doing, and that's how I would see that, because that's how I relate to the pentacles, and that's how I break down things numerologically in a general sense.
It sounds like it helps you be directive with them, and that's the key thing for me as well. It's like, what's the direction, not just the message. And I think that's because I would argue that you and I are both very active with our readings, in that it's not solely a reflective process, it's a developmental process of sorts.
That's probably a bigger discussion we could probably have at some point, because that's a really good point. This is a very different way of working with the cards.
Yeah, we will side note that for
side note.
So go into 2. For me, one of my favorite keywords, but this is just me all over, is integration. So that's one of my favorites for 2. I like duality for 2 as well. And I don't know, which is why I don't really have a keyword for this, because I've heard other people discuss it. And I think union has come up a few times. That's not part of my vocabulary naturally, but there's something about the point both between and the space between two things that creates some sort of tension, tether. Like conceptually, that's how I see it going on, but I can't give it a third keyword, if that makes sense.
Right. It's kind of like the void between it is, but it isn't. It exists, but it doesn't.
And I think that you can play with it depending on what's going on as well.
Do you relate the 2 to the High Priestess?
I do, but I feel like some of the liminal stuff that I work with the High Priestess is sometimes a bigger language that might be too big for some of the more microcosmic versions of the 2, if that makes sense.
Well, I was just thinking that, I mean, I relate the 2 to the High Priestess as well, but I was just thinking when you were talking about the in-between, that is liminal space, right?
So that could be my third keyword. We'll go for that.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like it.
Do you know what?
We'll just create our own structure right here.
I'm just adding that keyword to my list.
Perfect.
So for you, I'm assuming you're going to have some more solidified terms.
Well, I have duality for sure, because I feel like the 2 is kind of like a what's that thing called, where you have the thing in the center and then you've got the thing on the other side. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do. Although at first I'd pictured one of those. Not
that works too. That works too. But there's no central point in that. This is my weird visualization tip. Is that there's a name for that thing. So you put something on something and then it'll teeter one way or the other, right? Okay, so duality for me is kind of that central point. Yeah. And that's kind of the central key word for a 2 for me. And then it can swing one way or the other, which is why this little thing is kind of my visual, because it can either go into balance or opposition. And that's the 2 ways that I see the 2, because depending on not only the card and the suit and the imagery, but you also have the context of the reading, which I always sound like a broken record, but what the card, what the position it's in, what it means, what it relates to, whether you read reversals or not. That can mean, that same card can mean balance or opposition. So I feel like duality is like its core essence, but then it can tip one way or the other. Yeah. It's kind of like a just basic, like if I strip everything out, I mean, I could go into, nuances when you're looking at the individual cards and the suits and things like that. But in a general sense, it's kind of how I see the two.
I like that, because I suppose when I think of integration, I think of what potentially the opposite of that can be, without trying to make it too complex for people. And again, it's probably a discussion for another time, is that whatever way my keywords seem to lean, there is always the potential for them to be the complete opposite, dependent on how the thing comes up. So definitely, like, I suppose disintegration, or the just the refusal to integrate, fragmentation maybe would be like a nice polar one for that. But what I like about your 3 keywords, which perhaps is purposeful, but I don't know, so I'm going to share it with you anyway, is that you basically got duality and then have given an example of it with the other 2 concepts. So it's like you got the middle point and then did the other 2 as your evil.
Did the other 2.
And I love that, because I think that's a very helpful learning tool for people. But when I talk to people about numerology, and I talk sometimes about the 3 as a triangle and the 4 as a triangle, it really helps me conceptually. It's just I run out of shapes.
Yeah. So I do the same thing, and the 2 for me is the T.
Yeah.
So because it does that, or it can.
I love that. That will forever be like ingrained in my brain now.
That's awesome. Yeah, the 1 is like, it's the dot. So visually, little shape things. The 1 is the dot, the 2 is the T, the 3 is the triangle, the 4 is the square. Yeah, I do the same thing.
So you want to take 3 first?
Yeah, 3 for me, again, relating, 3 is very much Empress energy, also triangle, right? Like we were just talking about. It is creation, expansion, and expression are my 3 main keywords for that. And I really love the triangle. And I feel like we've talked about this before, but I don't remember if it was on the video or we just talked about it. But the triangle, because you've got that center point in the middle, like all of that in between. I love that idea of the 3 things coming together. And I like creation as a keyword, because the way that I read it is when you take the seed, the 1, and you add the 2, and you're going to do something with it, then you get creation.
Yes.
Something happens.
That's your actual conception. That's when you're then initiated. That's the first whoosh. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you have the idea, then you maybe plan out what you're going to do with the thing, and then you actually create the thing. You actually make it happen.
That's exactly how I view it as well.
I figured.
My keywords are the same. So expression, growth. I do have the other one you said, but I also have synthesis, which is just one of my
good one.
So
yeah,
it's all.
That's a great word, though.
Yeah, it's all very much of a muchness. I feel like there's perhaps more of a tether between those 3 keywords even than there are in some of the others. It's like the duality, like you said, is mirroring what duality means, whereas the coming together, it makes sense to me, the keywords, at least when we're not talking about blocks and stuff, that they are more complementary and more of a blending, a melding of that sort of thing. So
yeah, they're kind of interlocking. Like if you think of, our triangle metaphor, if you've got think of the 3 points as being those kind of 3 things, right? And we could even do, I think, 4 keyword, like now I'm getting off on tangent, but you could do like 4 keywords where you have each of the 3 points is the thing, and the space in the center is the creation. So if you have like expansion, expression, what was another one you had? Synthesis. And then that, when you bring that all together, that's what gets that creation energy.
I could see that. And I definitely feel like it's a movement, a growth. It's a key facet. It's the first, I guess, initial, shift's not quite the word I want. It's like the idea of integration in the 2 is realizing the 2 things that we want to bring together, whereas the 3 is the act of integrating. So again, it's conceptual.
I like too and one of the reasons that I think I do relate them to the major arcana is like the 2 for me is very internal. It's an internal expression, whereas the 3 is external.
Yeah. Yeah, because the high priestess is very inner world for sure. And then all of a sudden we start really sort of like nourishing that and bringing it outward.
Bringing it outwards, externalizing that. Yeah.
So moving on to 4, foundation is always, but I'm like the square, the foundation.
Yeah, the square.
So, and I guess my other 2 are very complementary to that, which is structure and boundaries, which I appreciate. Boundaries is perhaps a little nuanced, and I do have other things like stability and also power. They all blend for me, like it all makes sense as a form of a foundational structure. So it's like it all comes back to the foundation for me, is like the 4 keyword, and how I view the emperor in particular.
Yeah, I think that's real similar to how I view it. Definitely foundational. I have also like structure and stability. Those are but again, relating back to that emperor energy, and also, you know, the square, or if you think of it, you know, a chair with 4 legs, like all of those lovely metaphors that work to create this idea. Because once you take the thing and the 2, and this is for me, the numbers all progress. So I'm like, okay, I had the thing, I decided what I'm going to do with the thing, I started to work on creating the thing, but now I need to create some foundational work around that to sustain long-term growth. And that's where the 4 comes in. It's like if you're planting a garden, like you have to keep, I should not use garden metaphors, but if you're planting a garden and once it sprouts, right, you have to like tend it, right? You have to tend the plant or the flower or whatever. You have to water it. You have to take care of it. That is a little bit of that 𝗕𝗫𝗄𝐺 nourishing energy, but also there needs to be like some structure and stability and foundation and longevity to that in order to continue that work. And I guess that's kind of also how I see it. It's that taking that creative, that first flush of creation from the 3 and continuing to work with it.
Yeah, it's like building a regime and having some consistency to how we output that. Otherwise, you've got this lovely creation that you've got, and then it's gonna do what our plants do in real life.
Yeah. And wither and die. It's a good thing we're better at keeping animals alive.
Well, we will definitely stick to animals. Do you want to take 5?
Yeah, 5. I love 5 because 5 for me it's the shake-up number. So my main keywords are like conflict, instability, and upheaval. Those are my main keywords, because the thing with the 5 for me and the way I read progressively with the numbers is that, great, you've got that structure and the stability in the 4, but you can't sit in that forever. Because then you stagnate, then there's no growth happening. So the 5 is what comes in and shakes the status quo up. It creates the conflict or the instability. It's not always a bad thing. And I think that's the thing about the 5s. They get a bad rap for being, it's like the tower. The tower is not always bad, but the 5s get a bad rap for being the bad number, right? Because they're the upheaval, and it's the 5 of cups, and it's heartbreak and sadness and all of that. But sometimes you need that shakeup to get you out of that stagnation of the 4, or to keep the 4 from becoming stagnant, so that you can continue to progress. And that's really my kind of key understanding for the 5. That shakeup is sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it's always a conflict of some sort. It's an upheaval. Whether it's positive or negative.
And that's exactly how I view it. Like keywords again, I mean, I've literally got challenge, conflict, and I guess one of the ones I like to use, but it really depends if people are like familiar enough with it in their sort of everyday language, is contraction, which I appreciate sounds counterproductive. Lindsay Mack is someone who's spoken about it a lot, which is probably what got me into that keyword in particular. But the shape up is the contraction of what we know, and so I feel like that's why there's friction there. And it's like you say, it's not necessarily bad friction, but it is very, very damn necessary. But often our human response to challenge, to conflict, can be to contracts while we're shaking around, trying to go,
yeah.
So what do I do? Do I move to, which spoiler, but do I move to sort of like my expansion in the 6, or do I contract all the way back into my foundation, which then more likely to stagnate if we're going to just keep stepping back to that? Maybe it's for one instance, but not always. And as you can see, there's that relationship between the 4, between the
yeah, it's hard to talk about the numbers, I think, and to talk about reading numerologically without talking about the integration between the numbers, because they are a progression. If you're reading numerologically, most people are reading as a progression. They're not reading as standalones.
Yeah. And that's definitely how I see them as they come up. And even now when I'm thinking about it, and again, we won't go into it too much, but even when I'm doing all of the layers and stuff, I have that in my mind. Okay, 2 means I'm quite early on. 8 means I'm much further along in whatever experience this is. And that will almost always be in the back of my mind, is like how far I'm progressed based on what numbers are where.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the key elements we do in the dice casting system.
Yeah,
is the progression of the numbers. All the numerological associations in terms of the 1 through the 10 for that particular dice are all taken from my structure of how I work with just numbers in a general sense. But
which is a good
I definitely look at that.
That's a free offering of yours, and people could totally
yeah it's totally free. Lisa and I made it for fun because they wanted to play with dice.
They put all of this knowledge in and then went, here, have it for free. And I often know that people are moaning about that not happening, and it does happen often.
It does happen.
Even if you're not massively into dice casting, although experiment, it's fun. I've got
fun,
now.
I love that.
Yeah, it definitely helps numerologically, and just some other stuff. You can feel the tarot infusion, and it's both its own thing and complementary. And I feel like it's definitely serviceable for anyone who likes the tarot. So it's out there.
Yeah.
So moving on to 6, then I already said expansion. I've got like harmonizing, healing, nourishment, I think, and expansion are the 4 ones that I'm going to go with. But again, you can sort of see how they're bouncing off of each other, because we're going from the 3 and we've duplicated it, we've doubled it.
We've duplicated it.
So it's almost, for me, it's just more of the 3, which makes it's kind of yummy, I think. And it's probably one that I feel is perhaps more fluidly represented in the 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗎 as a number where they're sort of sharing that. Maybe not always, but more commonly, I feel like. Yeah.
And I'm skip ahead, and then when you get to the 9, then you're at the 9. Yeah. Yeah, I have similar keywords. Harmony is definitely one, but I also have transition and union.
Okay.
The 2 keywords that I really like for the 6, because I feel like once you get, out of that stability or instability of the 5, and then you're going to transition, you have to kind of readjust. It's not a keyword that I have down here, but I think that that's a great one. Is that kind of readjustment of things after that shakeup. It's kind of like you have to kind of get back to what is the what's good. And I think you said nourishing might have been a word, for you in that sense. And of course, depending on what you're looking at, but it's this idea of kind of, like you said, expanding beyond, moving beyond what happened in the 5.
And it's really interesting, because I would say that for me, the readjustment process is sort of, you like recalibrating, and this is just for me, recalibrating the 6, reflecting the 7, shifting the 8.
Same.
Yeah.
Very similar.
So I see it as like conceptually starting there, but perhaps in much more of a luxurious capacity. And then it gets a bit more internal for me in the 7, or at least like still, and then it really gets active in the 8.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued to hear your 7 now.
So a 7 for me, that is the moment of like introspection, assessment is a keyword I really like for that one, and also knowledge, because we're taking at the 7, we kind of like, okay, we had the growth, the foundation, we've got that going on. We had that instability that shook things up. We had to make those adjustments and reharmonize in the 6. Now we need to go, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
How do I take all of that and now assess what I'm going to do with it? Spend a little bit of time thinking about that. That's an introspection energy. And then what am I going to do with that? How am I going to put that into motion now? Because I'm not the same as I was at the 3 or the 4 or the 5. I've got all of that building up. And so now I get to take that and determine, how do I move forward with that? I love the 7 of Swords in the Rider-Waite-Smith. I know everybody's like, it's betrayal and it's whatever. And that is not how I see it. And I think it's a really cool card, because I actually see it as, we don't actually know what's going on. So we need to take a beat.
Yeah.
We need to take a beat and go, okay, I've got all of these things, right? He's got his little swords, but there's still other swords out there. So there's more work to be done. So how are you going to take that and move forward? And it's got that like kind of, it has a little bit of the echo of the 5. Like we remember that conflict. It's so not the Rider-Waite-Smith interpretation. So like, I'm so sorry to people, but that's just how I see it.
Mine isn't either. And I think that's what trips people up when I talk about the 7 of Swords in particular, because I am aware of, same as you, Rider-Waite-Smith, and I can read Rider-Waite-Smith. I'm never purist reading Rider-Waite-Smith, and it's also why it's I guess not a big, but just a general playful point of contention of mine, that people are always putting damn foxes on the 7 of Swords as well. But
a fox and a dude stealing all the swords every time.
Just anything like cunning, betrayal, theft. If people were going to look at all of the options in the 7 of Cups, I would, to even begin to explain how I approach it, I would say consider those swords in the same capacity, because I'm like, they all represent something to get to the 7. So like you say, you have to be introspective, because otherwise you don't really know what you're dealing with. So I very much agree. Introspection is a big one of mine. And really, I've just got options. I don't really know that I would add much to that. It's just basically that for me. It's like it's real, I think, like I said when I was talking about 6, it's a point of stillness in particular. And you said take a beat, take a break. It's like slowing down.
That key word, I think of like the betrayal that is often applied to the 7 of Swords. I think that we can still look at that through an introspective lens. Like, are you being, because we're looking in the suit of the mind, are you being honest with yourself about where you are right now?
Which is a great layer to put in, but it's so specific.
It's so specific, yeah.
And it seems like a lot of the time people read it as someone's backstabbing me. And as someone who doesn't tend to read that way anyway, it's just sort of a non-fit for my whole way of viewing tarot.
I definitely look at it as most of the time as, okay, I need to take a beat and assess some things here. Like, where am I at? What am I doing? And then I always think back to, okay, where was I in the 6? Where was I in the 5? Because that informs how I read this card moving forward.
Yeah, so it's very retrospective in that way. So I suppose that could be
that's another good keyword. Yeah, I like it. We should like write a book. We're good at this.
I'm adding that because I'm sure I use it, but clearly I don't have it written down. On to the 8. And the 8 is really, I may even put shift in there, but I feel like conceptually it needs the other stuff. For me, 8 it's very transformative. I see there's sort of like a manifestation or a skill to the 8 as well. And then I guess it depends where people fall on the whole 8 or 11 thing, because I will forever associate strength with the layer of 8 as well. So I feel like transformation, I do have devotion down, but again, I feel like it's the transformation and the shift for me in the 8 is one of the biggest things, because it's that movement from what we've taken from the retrospective, what we've taken from the introspection, what we're actually going to do and how we're going to move with that, and how we're going to use that skill, and how we're going to put it, all that we've got already, and maybe some of what we've left now, even though we're progressing, how we're going to put that into the works to get to the third 3, as it were, the third, how we're going to shift towards, you know, that final sort of iteration.
Yeah, I see it very, very much the same way. I have like mastery, conduct, and application is my main keywords. Because I feel like after you've done that reassessment, that introspection, that retrospective in some cases, like now you're ready to move forward and really like master or apply everything that you've learned. But I do love as an 8 too, you can also think of it as that foundational doubled, that 4 doubled. So you're building on a new foundation of a higher understanding than you had previously, because you've been through all these things, but also because it's that 4 doubled, depending on whether you're looking at light and shadow or reversed or whatever, it can also be stagnating too. So if you're not careful with it, right? And I guess that really goes into nuance and context, but it definitely can be a sort of a stagnation or a feeling like blocked in, because it is that 4 energy doubled, but also it's kind of like, I think of it as like the next, like if you stack a table on top of a table, right? You've got 8 legs and you're higher up now, right? Like maybe you can reach something higher. You've got a higher understanding because you've gone through all these lessons.
That's definitely something I relate to. Is like, I try and use most of them from almost a neutral perspective, and not because all the words are neutral, but because they have the possibility to go both ways, because we can be more informed about something and still make a terrible decision. So I think absolutely that, say the stagnancy multiplied, it has the capacity for both. And so whatever it is that we're shifting and applying, it really is then dependent on that nuance. It's definitely more structurally sound, because again, we've duplicated it. And then we get into the juicy 9.
Then we get into the 9. The 9s are like the orgasm number, I swear. They're like, it just is what it is.
It's like the numbers, clearly.
But you got like the 3 and the 6 and the 9, like you bring them all together and you're like, that's amazing. It's great. What are your keywords for the 9?
So for mine, I've got fulfillment, because I feel like that is one of the key facets for me, because the others are much more nuances. It's like tuned in, arrival is definitely like a sensation from me. And like I laughed and said bloom, but to me it's because I'm thinking about it again in the plant way, which should just not but it's like, yes, there's growth when you've got to the first tree and you start watering your seed and maybe you've got a little sprout, but it's not the end result. I'm talking, you have a rose bush, it's very sumptuous, and so there's something about that kind of that build up and arrival of that gives me like fulfillment, that gives me like just the bloom of getting there. So again, that's one of my ones where I tend to rely on one word with more like nuances than other keywords.
I tend to rely on one keyword really for the 9 too, which is interesting. The main keyword I use is amplification, because regardless of where you are and what card you're using, that amplification is like taking the energy of the suit to its highest pinnacle. It's why I use the orgasm metaphor with the nines, because it's taking it to its highest pinnacle before it tips over the edge of the 10. I made that totally inappropriate. I'm so sorry.
No, but I like that, because that's what the bloom is to me. But actually,
that's what the bloom is. Yeah, I was thinking about that when you were talking about bloom. That's what it is. Yeah, it's just this big burst of whatever it is, and it can be. So if we're taking a look at like the 9 of Swords, that is the amplification to the extreme in a negative sense, right? That is your inner critic just having a runaway with your brain, or, you know, even if you want to tie it back to nightmares, right? That is the amplification of your manifested horrors coming through your dreams, right? That tends to be, even though I have like multiple keywords, and I guess even though I have multiple keywords, I could tell you 1 through 10. I could give you like a progression, just a single keyword that would show the whole, like, this is how we go through the whole thing. But it's really, I think, most apparent in the 9, because that 9 energy just feels so like explosive. It's just, that's the pinnacle of, it's the orgasm, right? It's what you're trying to achieve.
And I feel like it's an important nuance, again, to my keyword, because in terms of fulfillment, I don't feel like fulfillment conceptually is something that we can stay in, which we will get into with the 10 and how it relates to the 1 and the cycle.
Yeah.
No doubt that we're going to get similar there anyway. And surprisingly have synced up very well, considering we have never discussed this really explicitly.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. But for me, that is that part of it. It's not a fulfillment that has this like eternal stopping point. For me, bloom and, like you say, the amplification, they all fit for me as words, because really the word is just trying to explain that process. I may write orgasm down on my keywords anyway.
It's one of, I mean, I guess it's not totally appropriate, but I feel like it really does visually express what the 9 is, because like you said, you don't stay there forever. Then you're gonna have, then we go into the 10, and then we're gonna have the like, that's like the afterglow. Right?
Well, and also, is a good thing if it's permanent? Like that is
right.
It's the it's a fallacy, really. And I know we like to think, especially in that instance, that it would be amazing, but the pure exhaustion and the expectation that would come with staying in one state perpetually and not having any of that other stuff. So it's very temporary.
It's fleeting.
Yeah.
It's fleeting. Yeah.
And I think that remembering that is actually useful for people as well, because it's not meant to be disappointing when we're not in that heightened, amplified state. It's just meant to come and go. And I often say to people when I work with them, one of the things that we can notice, not for everyone, but there's sort of a tie between excitement and anxiety in the way that they both show up in our bodies. So yeah, definitely. I love amplification for that. It's a great keyword.
Yeah, I think it really, like, I see the 9 as kind of like ramping up. And if we're looking at like numerologically, 9 is actually like the end in a sense, because then when we get to the 10, it's back around. So it's like, I've got like cycles, return, and wholeness. Interesting. I also have like boundaries as a keyword that I associate with the 10s too. You had that in, was that 3?
4. That
shows like when we get to the 10, we sort of have established the boundary, and we're going to come back around. And we can begin again at the 1. It's like the next level. We can begin again.
Yeah, and I suppose if we think about if we were going to double 5, although 10 behaves slightly differently, but if we were going to double 5, what do you get from the contraction once you've learned from it? You get the things that you put in place that actually they do fucking continue to shake things up, but just in a more peaceful, beneficial, nourishing capacity. Because that's exactly what true boundaries are, is they are nourishing, but they shake things up because... You know, if you've been a yes person forever, as an example, it's going to piss people off when you say no.
And no is a 10 word.
Yes, no is definitely a 10 word. You sort of, it's not like a down, is it? It's just sort of a minor dip into something more there's something more accessible, I feel like. 10s perhaps are just a little bit more, maybe even peaceful, I guess, settled than the 9, which, like you say, once you've gone all the way up amplified, you can't stay up there forever. So
yeah, and not to keep using like inappropriate metaphors, but they work really well for the 9 and 10. It is like the afterglow, right? It's things are good. You've got this understanding. You've got this sort of wholeness about the situation or whatever, the card itself. But it is a new beginning because now you've got a new understanding.
Yeah. And now you're done with that.
And now you're done.
Yeah.
And now you get to move on and do something else, right?
Yeah. And I think for me, that's why I still toy with the term ending in the 10 as opposed to the 9. But one of the things that I've got with the 10, along with like ending or completion, because it's cyclical, so whatever word people prefer, because I would use those interchangeably, is harvest, because I feel like that's what we do with the afterglow. We learn, you know, perhaps even for the next seed, perhaps not, it depends where that seed's taking us. And also I've got realization meets recognition. Like
that's great.
Yes, it's just that I'm doing all of these. So we've had, and now we've got
yeah. I think that's great. I love it. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, because it's just it's okay, now I'm in the afterglow, as you say. Now I've done all that accumulation and I've got to this completion phase and I'm in this glow. I recognize this is where I'm at. So I suppose that's where your boundaries come in that particular instance, with that nuance as well. It's I recognize where I'm at, and this is what I gain, this is what I harvest from this is what I learn. And again, as we've said the whole way through, that can be a great lesson and that can be a very painful one, but a lesson is ultimately a lesson either way.
Yep, that's very true. So can you take the numbers and run through them in like a just quick, succinct, like building upon each other?
With the keywords?
Yeah, well, even just like in describing like your understanding. So we start with the seed. Like if I were to ask you to just like in a basic paragraph or whatever, just explain to me the progression between the 1 through 10. What does that look like for you?
My brain's like, you want to do this right. You need to be more prepared.
No, off the cuff. Just go with it.
So we have the seed, and then the 2 would be working out perhaps what the seed needs, because it's going to be more than one thing that the seed needs, which is where the duality comes in. And then we move into growing, nourishing, nurturing the seed. And once we have done that, what we gain is an insight into its foundational core. But the difficulty with that is it doesn't matter how often we have a structure in place. Life exists outside of us and we get into the 5. There could be bad weather. There could, anything can happen that shakes that up. And so when it shakes that up, what we need to do is we need to recoup. And sometimes for me, that's almost going back to basics, although the 6 is more of that. It's the harmonizing. It is working out what works and what perhaps did the 5 challenge that I now need to add into the mix or take away and replace. The 7 would be more of the introspective layer of that, and perhaps an assessment phase for like, okay, so now here where we are with the 6, how is that actually going, rather than assuming, because we've learned from the 5, sometimes it doesn't always work out. And once we have assessed stuff, the 8 is more of I would say a final, a more informed plan and way to move through. And the 9 is the sweetness of seeing it come into full bloom. And the 10 is the takeaway of how we might behave with that going forward, or just a look back at what the experience was like and the lessons and the takeaways, and perhaps harvesting as well, which takes us back to, okay, it's not rose season anymore. This needs deadheading, and we're gonna follow its full cycle, and we're gonna come back here again. Yeah.
Yeah, that was beautiful. That was great.
I love that you put
and I think
and I'm like, fuck it, okay.
Yeah, I think that's, and the reason I asked, because I would encourage anybody who's interested in reading numerologically to do that. Like, if you're interested, create your own keywords, totally like Tegan and I have. Like, think about, what does that mean to you? What does a single thing mean to you? What does when you put two things together mean to you? What does when you put three things together mean to you, right? And then to take that and follow that, how do you see that structure from 1 to 10? Like for me, if I were to do it, like 1 is the thing. We start with that. This is the potential of the thing, right? And then I'm going to look at the different sides of that thing. Then I'm going to bring it into a creation with the 3, and then I'm going to create some structure and stability around that so I can work with it. But know that things don't stay the same always. So I know there's going to be a conflict, and there has to be, in order for there to be continued growth. And then in the 6, we get that transition of, now I've come through that, and I can understand that I've got these lessons I've learned, and I've got new stuff to work with. In the 7, I take some time to really think about that, to assess that, and to see how I use that moving forward, which brings me to the 8, where I actually put it into practice, which brings me to the 9, where I get to that ultimate amplification of that energy. And then these sort of come down, but also cycle back around to the wholeness, the completion of the whole thing. And then I can begin again. And I think that when you take that and then you start applying, then what does that mean in the suit of the Pentacles? What does that mean in the suit of the Cups? You know, what does that mean when we're talking about feeling? And if you can sit down and break that structure down for yourself, and what those numbers mean to you, or use ours to start with as a jumping off point. Yeah. And then look at how that relates to those suits and what they mean to you, you can start to develop your own sort of numerological understanding. Because while there are certain structures out there that do say this number means this and this number means that, there's nothing wrong with going your own way and determining what they mean for you. Yeah. Because that was a question we got. How do I learn to read numerologically? In my opinion, that's how you do it. That's the process I would suggest. And
be willing to be uncomfortable. Like, because it's, even for me, like, creating a story out of that that's cohesive enough for other people is always going to be a challenge. And apparently plant metaphor is the way forward for me.
A plant metaphor works fantastic. I mean, that's another great, like, think of any sort of process, any sort of thing you go through, you go through those 10 steps.
Yeah. Because when you described your 10 steps, I was listening to it and I sort of got taken to you actually like building something, like physically. That's sort of where my brain went mentally. And I think that was the interesting thing about yours, is a few people could probably layer their own concept onto it. Like you said, it doesn't have to be any one thing. If something makes sense to you, try and work the numbers through it and see how that influences your numerology. Because whilst things are cyclical and spiralic and all the other stuff, we still think in quite a linear fashion. And so take it from, 1 to 10 in a way that is familiar to you, because that may very well work. And people are probably now thinking, how is that familiar to you if you don't garden? But I grew up around gardeners, and that's probably, and I was dragged out into the garden and was told gardening stuff constantly. Conceptually, it's so integrated in my experience growing up that it makes sense. So definitely make it your own, but also, like Dawn, feel welcome to use our words if they're going to help you to start off with, because that's how I started off. And actually, one of the books that I've read, Tom Benjamin's workbook, that was very much like gather keywords from everywhere, and then expand upon that. So that's a good book for that. It's like a co-creation then between ours and what we have ingested through learning and other resources. But the more that you make it your own, the more that you'll retain it as a natural process in the cards. So, we did refer to our lists here, but when you're reading, it's just a different space to like try to reference something in a way that people can take away and do something with.
Yeah. And I think getting those ideas, you know, kind of mining from other places and then distill your own out of that. I mean, speaking of resources, like Lisa, I mean, I do shameless plug here, but Unlocking the Tarot, the key focus of that book is about working with keywords. And it's a great one. It's not necessarily numerologically based, but you can totally apply this to it. There's also the I haven't read the whole thing yet, but there's Tarot by Numbers, I think by Liz Dean is another
book. I've heard of that, but I've not read it yet.
I just started it. I just got it. And I just started it, and it's so I can't really speak to, you know, it's Liz Dean, so I'm sure it's wonderful, but you know, I haven't actually read it. Also Untold Tarot, which is technically a Marseille book, but it's got some
Matthews.
Yes.
I just put that on my wish list.
Oh, it's a really good one for numerological influences. It's Marseille, but when we're talking about numerology, I mean, you could take playing card numerology, you could take Lenormand, you can take all of that in. If those numbers make sense to you in terms of their energy and how you're working with your cards, then by all means use it. Like we're all about stepping outside the box.
We are. And speaking of which, just to give a little different flavor, then the Cartomancy book by Roger J. Horne, some of his is quite different to mine. He also talks about it in there because it's Cartomancy, so you can get different flavors of numerology as well from Marseille, from solely numerology discussions, from the Cartomancy, and then really just again make something that is true enough to your, your experience in the world, because the world is what we're trying to see and engage with and reflect within our tarot. So it has to be like I feel anyway, it has to be a reflection of how we understand the world and stuff to work for it to be
how we go about being in the world, because in order for your reading to be beneficial to you, if you're reading for yourself, you have to know where you're coming from and how you interact and engage with those things. If I say the 3 means creation and you're like, that's not a keyword, great. Like, don't use that keyword then if that's not how you see that energy. Because otherwise, if you're trying to apply my view of the world to your tarot reading, that's not necessarily going to work for you.
No,
it's a jumping off point, but
it would become very difficult, because then not only are you trying to memorize something, but it's separate from yourself. And that's, I guess, as we build our own, yes, you might keep some of our keywords, you might keep a lot of them, but it becomes yours when you have a relationship with it, and it's in the process that you build.
That happens over time too.
It is not quick, unless
it's not quick.
Maybe there's someone out there that's an exception to the rule. Cool for you.
It was not quick for either one of us. We've learned and adapted, and I don't know about you, but for me, mine shift and change because I've been reading tarot since I was in my 20s. I'm now in my 40s. I am not the same person. No. So my interpretation and understanding of the cards has evolved with me as I've grown and changed, because my place in the world and my view of the world has changed. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, and one of the reasons why I struggle so much with reading just strict out of one tradition or another, because that may not apply to where I am now and to who I am now. It's really important to remember to find yourself in your tarot reading. You're there. Find yourself. That's where you should be operating from. It's great to follow teachers. It's great to follow structures and traditions, but ultimately, like you got to read from who you are, not who someone says you should be, type of thing.
And literally the only thing that I would add to that, which very much echoes the sentiment of just everything we've just recapped, really, is for me, it's a relationship. And perhaps that seems strange to people if they view it solely as a deck of cards and without getting into beliefs and other stuff like that. It's a relationship with that tool, with that language, with that experience. It's a relationship and an extension of us. And so you have to be relational with it for it to make sense. Otherwise, yeah. If anyone wants to take anything away from this, as always, as the title suggests, beyond tradition also means beyond what we've said or anyone else. It is yours. Make it yours.
Make it your own. Yep, absolutely.
Well, I think that we've given people something to chew on, hopefully, and enjoy.
Hopefully.
Which is good.
Or we confuse the heck out of them. It's one of the two.
Hey, it's entertainment at the very least.
It's entertainment at that point.
All of the links and stuff will be below.
If you like the idea of using tarot with video games,
yes,
we do like to. Some of it is just honest to goodness goofing off inappropriately. But Lisa and I do live stream, and we do have 2 games. We have one that we play also with a couple of other tarot tubers now. If you are interested in seeing that side of things, we do use real dice and real cards while we play a video game, and it's quite interesting. It adds a whole nother level.
It's good fun. Dawn's obviously got her tarot channel as well, and her subscription on YouTube, and the duo creation with Lisa for the dice as well.
Yes, so, and the dice casting. Dice casting's good for numerology. That one actually relates.
It really is. I will put it at the top underneath Dawn's tarot channel, and then I'll add the other stuff. Until next time, and if you haven't seen the other 2 in the series, then I guess technically one of them was officially in the series, and one of them was the first live that Dawn and I did together, which really sort of birthed the series. But you can go and check both of those out on Dawn's channel. So there's lots of links. Check the bio. And thank you for coming and hanging out with us and talking or listening tarot.
Thank you for having me on your channel. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. And I look forward to being back on yours as well.
Yeah.
All right. See you later, everyone. Bye.
Hey, bye.